So here we have a passage, and again this passage is from Politics and History, and we will read the passage before we take the questions given on the right hand side. So it says here, a long held view of the history of the English colonies that became the US has been that England's policy toward these colonies before 1763 was dictated by commercial interests, and that a change to a more imperial policy dominated by expansionist militarist objectives generated the tensions that ultimately led to the American Revolution. I mean, such a long sentence. It's so difficult for us to get hold of these sentences, and it's a long sentence. Almost 25%, 30% of the para is just one sentence. So you might have difficulty reading this kind of sentence because the idea is not very clear. It says a long held view of the history of the English colonies. And what is that a long held view? The long held view has been that England's policy towards these colonies before 1763 was dictated by commercial interests. So the long held view about the English colonies that later on became the US, the long held view is that England's policy towards these colonies before 1763 was dominated by commercial interests, and a change to a more imperial policy dominated by expansionist militarist objectives generated the tensions that ultimately led to the American Revolution. So before 1763, English policy towards towards their American colonies was dominated by commercial interests, and after 1763, it was dominated by expansionist militarist objectives, and that led to the American Revolution. This is what the sentence wants to say. In a recent study, Stephen Saunders Webb has presented a formidable challenge to this view. So Webb has presented a challenge to this view. And what is that? According to Webb, England already had a military imperial policy. So according to Webb, it is not after 1763 that the policy became imperial. It was already there for more than a century before the American Revolution. He sees Charles II, the English monarch between 1660 and 1685, as the proper successor of the Tudor monarchs of the 16th century and of Oliver Cromwell, all of whom were bent on extending the centralized executive power over England's possessions through the use of what Webb calls garrison government. Garrison government allowed the colonists a legislative assembly, but the real authority in Webb's view belonged to the colonial governor, who was appointed by the king and supported by the garrison, that is, by the local contingent of English troops under the colonial governor's command. So what has Webb to say? The Webb says that from 1660 to 1685, all these English monarchs, they had this this thing called as garrison government. So when you look at the word garrison, garrison basically means military. So Webb says that the garrison government was there, and though there was a legislative assembly, the real power was in the hands of the governor, who was supported by the English troops. This is what Webb has to say. And according to Webb, the purpose of garrison government was to provide military support for a royal policy designed to limit the power of the upper classes in the American colonies. So what was the purpose of the garrison government? To provide military support. And the idea was to limit the power of the upper classes in the American colonies. Webb argues that the colonial upper classes, and what is that upper class? A coalition of merchants and nobility who favored self-rule and sought to elevate legislative authority at the expense of the executive. So he says that Webb argues that the colonial legislative assemblies represented the interests not of the common people but of the upper class, right? And it was, according to Webb, the colonial governors who favored the small farmer, opposed the plantation system, and tried through taxation to break up the large holdings of land. Backed by the military presence of the garrison, these governors tried to prevent the gentry and merchants allied in the colonial assemblies from transforming colonial America into capitalistic oligarchy. So we know that the governor was powerful, he had the support of the military, and he was supported by the garrison government. I mean, that is what the garrison government is all about. And then further on, Webb says that Webb's study illuminates the political alignments that existed in the colonies in the century prior to the American Revolution. But his view of the crown's use of the military as an instrument of colonial policy is not entirely clear. So the author has come here and given his opinion towards the end. This is what we mean, by the author's participation. The author has not participated and has not given his opinion until he reaches the last paragraph, where he says that Webb's study illuminates the political alignments that existed in the colonies in the century prior to the American Revolution. But his view of the Crown's use of the military as an instrument of colonial policy is not entirely convincing. This is what Webb says. England during the 17th century was not noted for its military achievements. Cromwell did mount England's most ambitious overseas military expedition in more than a century, but it proved to be an utter failure. Under Charles II, the English army was too small to be a major instrument of. So the author says that under Charles II, the English army was too small. So how could it have supported the colonial governor in America? Not until the war with France in 1697 did William III persuade the Parliament to create a professional standing army. And Parliament's prize for doing so was to keep the army under tight legislative control. While it may be true that the crown attempted to curtail the power of the colonial upper classes, it is hard to imagine how the English army during the 17th century could have provided significant military support. So the author is questioning Webb's idea. So if you look at the whole passage in perspective, you will realize that there is a traditional opinion, and the traditional opinion says that the policy of that England's policy towards America was dominated by commercial interests before 1763. Only after 63 it was dominated by militarist objectives, and that militarist objective led to the what the author says American Revolution, right? And then later on he goes on to say that according to Webb there was legislative assembly and there was garrison government. The garrison government was basically supported by the military, right? This is the purpose of the garrison government. And the legislative assembly was purely for namesake, because the real authority belonged to the colonial governor, who was supported by the garrison. And then Webb says that Webb argues that colonial assemblies represented the interest not of the common people but of the upper classes. And then he says, then author in the third paragraph gives his own opinion. He says that Webb's study illuminates the political alignments, but his view that the crown's use of military as an instrument is not convincing, because England was not noted for its military achievements. So how can the military support the colonial governor? And then so on and so forth he adds towards the end that while it may be true that the crown attempted to curtail the power of the colonial upper classes, it is hard to imagine how the English army during the 17th century could have provided significant military support for such a policy. So the author is doubting it. He says it's a good thing that he has done, but I have serious misgivings about the whole affair. So this is what the whole passage is all about, and we can have a look at the questions and try to answer them. So the first question says that the passage suggests that the view referred to at the start of the first para argued that. So the view referred to at the start of the first paragraph. So a long-held view of the history of the English colonies that became the US has been that. So what is the view? That the view was that the colonial governors were sympathetic, but that is, the colonial governor has come later on, and you have to answer for the view of the first paragraph, not about the colonial governor. The point is, people, when you are marking the answer, you have to go to the right area of the passage. The colonial governor has come towards the end after Webb has come into picture, and the question is from the start of the paragraph. So the view which has come at the start of the paragraph should be the view captured by the option, and the colonial governor has not come at the start of the paragraph. And Charles II also has not come. So you come to see now, the American Revolution was generated largely out of a conflict between the upper class and merchants and small farmers has come later on in the passage. So why should you mark something which has come later and not at the start? The only option is this word. Look, the word 1763, and the word 1763 has come at the start of the passage. So the military did not play a major role as an instrument of colonial policy until 63, precisely the answer. Because the long-held view is that before 63 it was commercial interest, and after 63 it was militarist objective. That means basically military did not play a role before 63 or until 63. Because after 63 military might have played a role as per the views of the other historians. But Webb's view is that no, there was a role before 1763 as well. So D is the right choice. You have to go by what has come and not by what is remotely found in the passage. So you're not answering for what has come in the second, third, and the last paragraph. I mean, so D is the best. I think it's an easy question. Now let's go to the second question. The second question says, it can be inferred from the passage that Webb would be most likely to agree with which of the following statements regarding garrison government. So look at A. Garrison government gave legislative assemblies little authority. Yes, garrison government did not give the assembly because the assembly was in the favor of the upper classes of America. The real power was with the colonial governor, and you can see that clearly in the paragraph. It is given here that, I will just read it here, garrison government allowed the colonists a legislative assembly, but the real authority belonged to the colonial governor. So straight away you have the option. It's crystal clear to us that garrison government gave assemblies little authority and compared to the authority it gave to the governor. So I think A is straight away. I mean, you see that in the paragraph. And then there is, once you have seen it, why there is no need to disprove B, C, D, any. B says garrison government proved relatively ineffective until it was used by Charles II. I mean, ineffectiveness until used by Charles II, nowhere it has come in the passage, so it has to go out. Garrison government became less viable. Again, the viability part is not coming in. And Oliver Cromwell was the first ruler. Again, all these things are not implied or given, so why should we mark these? I mean, they all go out. A is the best choice and the right answer. The third question. According to the passage, Webb views Charles II as the proper successor. Why is Charles II the proper successor? So let's go and check the first paragraph. Why is Charles II the proper successor? So once you go here, and it has come in the first paragraph, right? It has been mentioned. He sees Charles II, the English monarch, as the proper successor, all of whom were bent on extending centralized executive power over England's possession through the use of what? So Charles II is the proper successor. Why? Because he was bent on extending the power through the use of garrison government. That's the reason why he's a proper successor. So you have to mark the choice such that it matches with what is given there. So used military. Used military means garrison government, right? It clearly says here, right, that all of whom were bent on extending centralized executive power over England's possession through what Webb calls garrison government. So they all were bent on using garrison government, right? So see here in option, I will go to question number 2 for a while. Some people might have marked D. Oliver Cromwell was one of the rulers to use garrison government, but not the first English ruler. So the first is something which is wrong here. Anyways, I am pointing out an error in the option. So some of you might have marked option D for the second question, but he was not the first. I mean, we don't know whether he was the first or the second or the last. We don't know. B is the best choice because he used military. Military means what? Garrison government, right? So used colonial taxes for military expeditions. No, not given. Wish to transform America into capitalist or no, they did not wish. In fact, they wanted to prevent this from happening. That's why they wanted to curb the power of the upper classes. Because if they had not curbed the power of the upper classes, then America might have become capitalistic oligarchy. So this is what they did not desire. Resisted the English Parliament's efforts to exert control over the military. They did not resist because the Parliament's role has come later on in the passage, not at the time of Charles II. So again, D is out of place. They're not allowed. They gave the assembly, but they restricted the powers. The real powers were in the hands of the governor, colonial governor. So B is the best choice and the right answer. Let's take the fourth question. Which of the following, if true, would most seriously weaken the author's assertion in the last sentence of the paragraph? So you have to go to the last sentence of the paragraph and you have to weaken the author's assertion. So what is the author's assertion in the last paragraph? You have to understand that. In the last paragraph, the author has clearly doubted whether he's doubting a Webb's study. He says that the Crown's use of military is not convincing, and you have to doubt. That means you have to show that the crown could have used military. If the author says that crown's use of military is not convincing, that means you have to go against what the author has to say, and then you have to say that yes, the crown's use of military could have been convincing, right? So you have to go and check which option does that. You have to speak in the favor of military. B can be the choice, right? Because it relied primarily on the symbolic presence of the military, garrison government could be effectively administered with a small number of troops. So in the last part of the passage, the author says that it is hard to imagine how the English army during the 17th century could have provided significantly military support. Right? So the author says that they could not have provided, and the option says that because it relied on the symbolic presence, it could be effectively administered by a small number of troops. That means the troops could have been effective, which the author is doubting. So B is definitely weakening the author's point of view. A says because they were poorly administered, Cromwell's overseas military. What has Cromwell to do here? In the last line here, has Cromwell come into picture? So A has to go out. Until early in the 17th century, no professional standing army in Europe had performed effectively. So they will support the author's argument. And the point is, if you look at D and E, the effectiveness is not coming out. See, the army was there, no doubt about it. But the author doubts that could they have done it. So you say that many of the colonial governors appointed by the crown were also commissioned army officers. They might have been commissioned army officers, but they may not have the sufficient numbers to effectively control the colony. So it is see, the effectively administered point is very important. None of the options D and E mention that. They simply mention that yes, the troops were there, they were stationed, they were controlled by commissioned army officers. But was it effective? Was it not? D and E are not mentioning that, and that's the reason why they go out. Question number 5. So for this question, B is the right choice, no doubt about it. Fifth one says the author suggests that if William III had wanted to make use of the standing army, mention the second last sentence of the last paragraph, to administer garrison government, he would have to. So we have to check about William III in the last part of the paragraph and then check what he has to say. So when you go to the last paragraph, it says here that that not until the war with France in 1697 did William III persuade the Parliament to create a professional standing army. And Parliament's prize for doing so was to keep the army under tight legislative control. That means William III persuaded the Parliament to create a standing army. And the condition was that they will be under legislative control. That means basically they would be under the control of the Parliament. So in effect, if William III had to make use of the standing army, see, if William III had to make use of the standing army, then he would have to take permission from the Parliament because it was under Parliament's control. C is the right choice. So I would say easy question. Most of the questions were easy, though you might have found the passage little offbeat because of the unfamiliarity of history of English, the English colonies in America. Still, you can look at the broad ideas and mark the answers. So relatively, I would say an easy passage.